I wish to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nations on whose land we are gathered today. We pay our respects to their elders past and present. Welcome to PhD Raw, a podcast about the curveballs of PhD life. Today's special guest is Andrew Carnegie from Carnegie Consulting Group. At Monash University here, we've had a long-standing relationship with Andrew. He facilitates our safer conversation workshops for both our academic community and our PhD students, and we're going to explore today the importance of feedback, how to best deliver it, but also some of the issues that pertain to that. So I'm going to throw it over to Andrew so he can introduce himself, and then I'm going to ask all the tricky questions.
Thanks, Pete. So my background, I originally started working as a clinical neuropsychologist, but for most of my career, I've been in the space of organisational psychology. So working with organisations and their people around how we can create great places to work. So at the heart of what I do is good behavioural science, but I also do quite a bit of work in leadership. So always applying some of the newer principles around organisational development and management scholarship to my work.
Yeah, fabulous. So our relationship initially started because there's been raised issues related to PhD behaviour and difficulties in having conversations with their supervisor and vice versa that become effective. And we've run multiple workshops related to the safe conversations. What are the common things that kind of get thrown at you from both the academic community but also the students in those workshops?
Yeah, look, I've got to say first, it was a great opportunity because I've worked around universities for over a decade, and this is consistently one of those issues that get discussed, but it's sort of almost invisible. Nobody wants to really talk about it. So it was a great opportunity to partner with you and the faculty in developing a program and co-developing a program where we could help both supervisors and students sort of navigate some of those challenging elements and circumstances that can happen and often happen in these types of situations. So, these programs, we run them for half a day. We run a half a day one for students, half a day one for supervisors. They really focus on some of the important aspects of how you set up these relationships for success. And it always amazes me, people get married, they spend a lot of time working on those things. We buy houses, all the big sort of decisions we make in life, we spend a lot of time and there's almost contracts and terms of agreement. But often people just jump into, the supervisor-student relationship without any preparation, without anybody sort of sitting down and talking about what are my expectations, what are my needs, what's your style, what do you need from this relationship? It's sort of something that just often gets thrown together, and no surprises sometimes that it doesn't always work out well. So what we're focused on in this training is firstly understanding where do things go wrong, and they often happen around communication, the lack of it, the lack of consistent, clear communication, the lack of communication around expectations and needs. It often comes in the sense of setting expectations around how often we need to catch up, how often we need to check in, how much support do you need, how much autonomy do you need. Often happens around style, particular behavioural styles. Some people, are very much like the supervisor who almost has a parentified model looking after them. Others, that they find that almost not only awkward, but it gets in their way. So in these workshops, students were often raising, some of these challenges they had with their supervisor. And look, there's some great examples too where, things just seem to work out really, really well. They gel. But a lot of the stories we're hearing were around, there's some challenges, and it started out well, but then something happened. It went off track. From the supervisor's perspective, and they're supervising the student, but they've got a whole range of other things, responsibilities and accountabilities on their plate. So, sometimes for them it's that student who needs, more supervision than others, that student who just doesn't seem to get it or listen to what's going on, that student who has some personality characteristics that they find, difficult to sort of not only understand but difficult to work with. And of course, what we're seeing is a rise in students with some mental health issues as well. In fact, in a recent study in the UK sort of pointed to that, this PhD, student supervisor relationship often accounted for about a third of students experiencing mental health issues. So a whole range of things. And these workshops are not only an opportunity to discuss these issues, but we do a lot of role playing, case scenario, really trying to help build skills for both students and supervisors to not only set this relationship up for success from the very beginning, but also how to navigate potentially some of the challenges and the dynamics that occur, over this sort of 3 to 4 year period.
Yeah, fabulous. So one of the things that I've noticed in my role as Associate Dean is that, we all, when we start our academic career, we have our own style of supervisory behaviour and the way we go about our business. And that sometimes changes as you get more senior or whatever. But some supervisors are really kind of hands off and let the students go, and some students and supervisors have a really tighter relationship. And sometimes students with that sort of loose hands-off approach look at the supervisor that's tighter and they think they're getting kind of shortchanged. And I sometimes would argue that it's the other way around in many ways, given the objective. I guess the thing that I'm most kind of curious about is, the supervisor-student relationship is hierarchical, and that means, there's a relationship and power structure difference. In Australia, we academics kind of see it, that many of their PhD students as colleagues, probably primarily, although not all, but students don't see it that way at all. I had a personal experience when my student wouldn't hop in the car with me because I was the professor. I was like, well, hang on a second, do you know what I mean? And so, and I was kind of blindsided by that, even though I'd supervised 25 students. So how difficult is, I guess the question is really, given there's that hierarchical relationship and both parties see it quite differently, how difficult is it to be courageous, and what sort of courage is required to raise an issue when there's that imbalance?
It's really difficult because this is a relationship where the student is both dependent and subordinate to their supervisor. So, it not only, causes a power dynamic, but it sort of causes this a lack of empowerment for the student as well. So it's very difficult when things aren't going well to raise the conversation. And what we hear is, that there's often a sense of either fear or safety in that. If I raise this, it's going to have consequences. And, traditionally universities haven't been so good at listening to these issues. So it takes a lot of courage, and often it's, how do I do this? And how do I do this in a way that's going to be constructive? How do I do this in a way that's going to preserve the relationship? How do I do this in the way that, it's not going to get my supervisor really upset and, suddenly everything's going to break apart? So often, because of all those elements, students do nothing. They just sort of sit in that relationship that's not great. And often they withdraw a little bit, which has a tendency probably just to compound things and make them worse. The supervisor sitting there thinking, something's going wrong here, and my student sort of is disconnecting from this. But they're doing that because they're sort of just trying to manage or survive in this sort of situation they're finding increasingly difficult.
So from the two parties, from a student's perspective, what would be a couple of simple strategies to kind of step out of that sort of withdrawal and to have that conversation that's really required? And then I'm going to ask you about what the academic can do as well, because many of the academics, I think, will be quite shocked by hearing that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So early intervention is the key.
Yeah.
So one of the things we focus on in the training program is what are those red flags? And they're probably no different than red flags in many other relationships. And I not only see this in student-supervisor relationships, but I see this in just generally in the workplace where people are having challenges with their direct supervisor, manager, or leader. So early intervention, as soon as I see some of these warning signs, and it's not like just today, just tomorrow, it happens over several weeks, that's when I want to have the conversation. And so in the program, we give people a framework for having that conversation. We do call it the courageous conversation. Courage coming from the French word cœur, heart. So it takes a little bit of heart to have these conversations. But often people are very nervous and not confident having a conversation because they just don't know how to do it. So this structure of how I focus on the behaviours, which is really important. I don't, personalise it. You're being mean, you're being a bully. I want to focus on the behaviour. When you don't return my emails, when you have cancelled our last number of appointments, when you're not able to provide me sort of feedback. So focus on the behaviour where the student can have this conversation in a way that allows them to send a message to their supervisor that something's just not working here. I don't know exactly what it is, but I'm noticing some behaviours, and in this sort of formulaic way of approaching their supervisor, they're able to say, this is how I'm feeling about this, and this is the impact that's happening. So for example, you're not returning my emails. That's a behaviour. I'm feeling really worried and concerned about that, and I can't progress to the next stage of my piece of research or the piece of work I'm doing until I sort of have an understanding about, am I going in the right direction? So it gives a clear understanding about, I'm concerned, I'm worried, I've focused on your behaviour, but I'm also talking about there's some consequences. And, I think every supervisor would like their student to be successful in their PhD. So, it gets to the heart of, what might be at stake if we don't address these particular concerns.
Yeah, we all start from the same position. Everyone wants the student, the supervisor, and the institution wants the student to have a PhD. So it's really important that sometimes we go back to that as well. So what about the academic that's sitting there listening to this and going, well, I thought I was having creating a safe environment for my students, and maybe I'm not. What's a couple of things that supervisors can do? Really simple actions or messages that can convey to their teams, but sort of PhD students to say this environment's safe, and you can come and have that conversation with me.
Yeah. So I think again, when we have an issue, early intervention the key. But I think this starts at the very beginning of the relationship. How the supervisor will sit down with the student and set out some expectations. Now, across the training, we found that a handful of people did this. They sort of sat down and they said, "No, this is how I operate. How do you operate?" A lot of them focused on the sort of mechanics of doing the PhD. They didn't often focus on the interpersonal elements. But I'd really suggest have that conversation as well. In the training program, we gave everybody a very short sort of personal style assessment that allowed them to sort of think about how they preferred feedback, how they like communication, what happened when they were feeling under stress. So they were able to identify not only their warning signs, but others. So I really suggest that supervisors from the get-go set up a bit of a contract in many ways with their student. This is how it is. These are my expectations. It can be a living document. So as the PhD progresses, they might come back to that every year. How are we tracking? But it's at the start set some expectations. And one of those expectations may be that when things are getting to this sort of point, we have the opportunity to raise that with one another, and that's the expectation. I think supervisors, they often see the warning signs, and that's the interesting thing. They often see, a sort of sign that something may not be right. One supervisor said, one of my students got up and just walked out and just slammed my door. Do you reckon that might have been one of those signs that they may not have been doing too well. Well, may well have been. What did you do? Oh, what do you do in those situations? Well, often people do nothing. But I think they're the sort of signs that supervisors need to pick up on and say, I'm noticing these sorts of things, and that's just not like you. Or I'm a bit concerned. Very much, again, using that very similar, formulaic approach for having a courageous conversation and doing it early. Supervisors also were seeing a whole range of other things. Mental health issues were one of the things that were spoken about frequently in the group, and a sense of, is it my place to go there? Well, I think, there is a duty of care when you're, supervising a student. You don't have to be their counsellor or psychologist, but you can certainly talk about, what you're noticing from the behaviours. Some supervisors spoke about, different styles that they had with students. And sometimes those styles, create a little bit of friction or tension in the relationship. And it's trying to be able to step back from that and not take it personally as a supervisor. And of course, we've also got a whole lot of international students at Monash University. Now they're got an interesting dynamic. For most of them, English is not their first language, but it's also a very different culture, and they're often quite isolated from their support network. So that relationship with their supervisor becomes even more critical. But it's also more tenuous.
Yeah, that's right. I couldn't agree more with that. It's like culture plus the subtleties of a language that we use naturally to cue things is not there sometimes, and so it can kind of, if you're not paying proper attention, you can get yourself wrapped up in a bit of trouble pretty quickly.
Yep.
So what happens when the student musters up the courage to raise something and it's not well received? You know what I mean? It's like the academics not seeing it for what it is, but has kind of got on the defensive. And so what should the student do then? Well, it's a plan B, isn't it, really?
It's plan B. So I think in those situations, what I'd recommend is it's follow-up email to your supervisor. So I've had this conversation, I've raised this. You might even articulate exactly what I've said in an email. And, often these type of conversations can be a bit confronting. I mean, it's not like suddenly everything happens and falls into perfect place. As you said, you may be a seasoned supervisor here, and getting this sort of feedback might really throw a curveball. So your sort of first reaction may be one of being a bit defensive or a bit frustrated or pushing back. So what I'd suggest is you always let a little bit of time go by, and maybe the student follows that up with an email, not a confrontational one. So we had this conversation. I raised this. I said this. Really like you to think about it. And a lot of the time when people have these conversations over a couple of days, it sort of sinks in a bit. The person may even go home and mention to a partner, this person said I did this. You do that. Oh, okay. Have that opportunity to reflect on it, and no matter how sort of experienced we are, no matter how senior we are, we've still got an opportunity to learn. I mean, we are in a learning institution. So I would leave it for a couple of days. But at that point in time, if things aren't sort of shifting and you're sort of getting the closed door from the supervisor, I think it's time to sort of take it to someone else.
Yeah.
And, maybe another, more senior person within the faculty or the school. I wouldn't sort of entertain sort of discussing it amongst your PhD colleagues, because sometimes you create a whole other scenario there, which can be really difficult to stop once that contagion effect
gets a bit
happens.
Gossipy rather
it gets
than
a bit gossipy,
solution based.
and then you're creating another whole problem, because sort of talking behind people's backs. Sure, people often want to share their experiences with their students, with their PhD colleagues and peers, but keep it respectful. But yeah, I'd definitely look to then escalate that and go and have a conversation with the head of school, someone else that you can sort of raise this with, and just say, look, I've tried to have the conversation. Here are the key things, and you need to be able to operate on facts here. So, I always encourage, PhD students to note things down. How many meetings have been met? What's happened here? When the person said something to you, write down exactly what they said if you felt it was inappropriate or unhelpful. And then you can present that as sort of factual data. You're not trying to build a case here, but what you're trying to say is something's not right and I might need some extra help in, help addressing this and managing it.
Yeah, from my perspective, the escalation thing is a really a challenging thing because the timing of it is super critical. One of my observations is that students sometimes read too much into what's going on and they escalate it instantly to the coordinator or to myself. And then my first response is, have you addressed it with the supervisor? And they go, no. And they say, off you go. You need to go and have those conversations first. But the consequences of escalating too early are also significant. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, look, I think if you escalate it too early, you create a whole other issue. I mean, it's almost a symptom of already a fractured relationship. Well, why didn't you go and talk to your supervisor first? It's a matter of respect. We'd all hope if there was an issue that, or our behaviour was having a negative impact, that we'd first hear it from that individual. So we need to encourage that. I think it gets really difficult when it's escalated because it's already out there now. And, it sort of amplifies the issue. It creates a trust issue then between the supervisor and their student. I sort of felt like you threw me in front of the bus here. And a lot of the time I find that when people have this conversation, it's a misunderstanding. Or the person says, look, yeah, thank you for pointing that out. I didn't realise I was doing that. Or, yeah, I need to pay more attention. I need to change some of my behaviours. If we don't get any feedback, how do we know where we're going? And often the feedback, a PhD student will get will be solely on their piece of work. It won't be on some of the things around the edges. Nobody wants to talk about behaviour. But, when I see these things, often a very successful PhD student will say it was all about the relationship. I had a good relationship with my supervisor, and I see those relationships continue. That student goes out and they ask their supervisor to come back and be a peer reviewer or a co-author on their paper. It can be almost a very long and successful and productive relationship. But what we do know, and some research out of the UK recently, about 50% of students who leave their PhD put it directly down to a bad supervisor relationship. So that's a very high number. Out of those, a significant proportion felt they were bullied in there, and others felt that this relationship led to a mental health issue. So I don't think any supervisor wants to have that impact. The impact they want on a student is something around growth and development, innovation, discovery, not that in any way I feel worse off from this relationship.
Yeah, no one wants to be in that. No one wants to land there ever. But it is, and it is sad and sometimes shocking when you hear those numbers and that relationship breakdown is. I don't want to say we see a lot of it, but then so a couple of things there I want to unpack is one. We don't see a lot of it, and the sort of the feedback we get is generally okay. But then I wonder how much is not visible from the student just putting up with it, going, I have to. This is my lot. I'm just need to get through my PhD. So if a supervisor is kind of behaving in a way that's consistently poor. And the student hasn't been successful, where's the escalation points for that? When does a peer need to step in, or again, is it early, or is it afterwards? I feel like this is a real behaviour gap in general. It's like we walk past the behaviours we're willing to accept, and at the same time, we see people doing things that we might not think is appropriate, and we kind of allow it to happen. So, what's the strategy there for a head of school or for, someone more senior? Or do you put coaches in place, or do you put mentors in place?
Well, look, I think if you are seeing some consistent behaviour from a supervisor, and sometimes I've had supervisors, and that's how I was treated. When I did my PhD, and it's almost this generational element they're handing down. But of course, things have changed dramatically over the last couple of generations. We have a whole generations of students that aren't going to accept being treated that way. We have a whole range of different pressures, in society now. Mental health issues are up, stress issues are up. So there's a whole range of things that are now creating more significant pain points in people's lives. So, look, I would always take a restorative approach here. Help guide, and it could be coaching or mentoring. I think I would really encourage, as you've been running the training across the faculty, that other faculties consider that. They also consider that they have a framework for setting up these relationships for success. It could be very simply at the start of this relationship, which in many ways, these days can last longer than a marriage. So why aren't we developing some sort of contract or understanding, commitment at the start around, how we're going to do this, how we're going to, provide feedback, how we're going to communicate, but also how we're going to deal when we might run into some problems, because there's always going to be some problems. I mean, anybody can be a fair weather captain. So what happens when we run into an issue, which could be something happening in the student's life, something happening in the supervisor's life that suddenly starts impacting on how they're interacting and communicating, with the other person? How do we deal with those? And if you have a plan up front, then people know what to do. In that plan may also be what happens if we can't sort it out. Now, I'd always suggest there that, again, we take a restorative approach, that someone from the faculty comes in and sits down. It's not this, I'm going to go and tell you what to do. Sit down and almost have a facilitated conversation. So something's going on. Let's have a chat about it. Because we're all about trying to ensure that, we are protecting relationships, we are supporting relationships, and when things get off track, we're here to try to address those and, in some ways remediate it, get it back on track. So, there might be someone in the faculty, might be you, Pete, who, sits down and has these conversations and just brings people together. And if people know there's a process for these, and they know this is what I do. If I get to this point, this will be my next, opportunity to address this issue. But first, what we're encouraging from both the student perspective and the supervisor, have the conversation. Communication is the cause of all our issues, but it's also the cure when we get it right.
Yeah, and one of the challenges we all have in a complex institution like Monash is that, you're sitting at pardon the pun, the coal face in a school, and you don't know every procedure and policy, et cetera. And so it's often important that, if something's going wrong, go and find out, go speak to someone who will know what to do and seek advice. And then what happens often is that step of just asking someone, what do I do, it's kind of missing it at times. And I don't want to say it's frustrating. It's just, it doesn't always have the same positive outcomes as if you go through that process. Do you know what I mean? Where, the policy says or the procedure says, this is what we do. Everyone knows what the game plan is, and then you can execute it. And with the aim of, I like the word restoration. I think I used to use the word redemption, but restoration is probably a much nicer word. You can at least try and fix things. So, I had a question about. I've lost my train of thought in the middle of my podcast, but anyway, so we could always just trim this out. I had a question that sort of relates to when the opposite is happening and the mental health of the supervisors suddenly becoming a problem. I think there's this challenge that students kind of put the supervisor on that hierarchical pedestal, and their lives are kind of I don't want to say perfect, but they're excellent at what they do, and nothing much goes wrong in their world. And that's not what happens at all. That's
right.
We're people, and our our lives can go a bit pear-shaped at times, and our mental health can be challenged as well. What happens when your supervisor's got a mental health challenge, and what should the student do who might be picking up some of the cues?
Yeah, that's a tough one, and you're right. Students are looking at their supervisors. That's where I want to be. So that they often do put them up on that pedestal and sort of think that that they're almost Teflon, nothing's sort of impacting. But you're right, life impacts everyone. It's a hard one because I don't think it's the student's role necessarily to suddenly become the support person for their supervisor. I think that they can show empathy and concern, and that's one of the key elements that we're encouraging students, but particularly supervisors, to have empathy, try to understand. And empathy is that sense of trying to understand what someone might be experiencing in their life, what they might be feeling. Compassion's really, really important. A lot of research on, compassion or supervision compassion is really, really important. But I think the organisations that sort of do this well have opportunities for also supervisors to be connecting, or that faculty staff to be connecting with one another. So peers can notice someone not doing well, and be that first front line of defence. Students may have an avenue where they can look. I'm noticing things. I don't know what's going on, but I'm a bit concerned. But I think it becomes a bit fraught if they sort of it's almost a boundary issue if they then start becoming that support person for their supervisor. So my suggestions there is that they may use that same avenue to escalate it up to the nominated person who can be that person to go to if I'm having a challenge with my supervisor or something's not happening here. They can talk to it, and they can talk to that person around what their concerns are. But I think the best way to do it is have that peer-to-peer support, where supervisors are getting together, occasionally to talk about how's supervision going for us.
Share their practices.
They're sharing their practices. And that was a great thing we found when we got those supervisors in the room. For most of them, they said, this is the first time I've ever had to have this conversation. And it's a good one because I'm sharing some of my experiences, I'm sharing some of my challenges. But what we also saw them sharing was some great tactics and techniques that they'd picked up. And others are going, oh, I don't do that. I should do that as well. So having just those forums regularly would be a really helpful way for supervisors to be connecting at a different level.
So Andrew, you've seen through your experience the behaviours of supervisors. What are some of the characteristics of an excellent supervisor, and compare that with a supervisor where there's some room for improvement?
Okay, so I think your really good supervisor is one that from the very beginning of the relationship builds the rapport with their students, spends a bit of time getting to know them and a little bit about their life, not being intrusive. You don't need to know everything about people's life, but knowing enough about that person's life that they see them just beyond a PhD student. They see their larger life and the other sort of things they've got going on, their other interests, their other goals, their other aspirations, who does spend a bit of time at this very start negotiating how this is going to work. This is my expectations. This is how often I'd like to meet. This is how I provide feedback. If things aren't going right, this is how I would like to address it. And equally giving the student the opportunity to say, well, this is how I like feedback, because people like feedback differently, whether it's positive or critical. This is how often I want to meet. So they're working on the commitment, the time commitment, how they'll communicate, how often they'll communicate. They're also talking about their stylistic differences, because everybody's different. You might have an extroverted, supervisor, an introverted student who suddenly feels like, this is just too much energy for me. I'm overwhelmed by this person. But having that conversation up front helps people understand that and allows them to depersonalize it, but also allows them when things are getting, maybe a little bit challenging to have the conversation, to have that open, honest conversation very early on. So I think that's what a good supervisor looks beyond, their technical skills. Bad supervision comes in a number of shapes and forms. The worst one is the abusive supervisor who uses the student as a scratching post. You're stupid, what you're doing is insignificant, how could you be making those mistakes? So the person who really dresses down the student and actually creates an environment of fear. Now, interestingly, fear gets people to do stuff. Gets them to jump, gets them to do stuff. So it can be quite empowering, and often it's that supervisor who likes a little bit of control. Now we know that's incredibly toxic for students. And maybe a PhD will come out at the end, but so will a whole lot of other challenges, and I'll probably never want to see that supervisor again. There's the directive supervisor. It's not so much abusive, but it just disempowers their student. This is how you're going to do it, and doesn't allow their student to make any decisions around their research. It's got to be my way or the highway. So students will just manage that through compliance. Compliance is not a great way to innovate. Compliance is not a great way to discover. Compliance probably just got you what it got you last time. There's your passive supervisor. They're asleep at the wheel. Now, that was my experience when I did mine. I had a passive supervisor, and no matter what I did, he was benevolent. He was a lovely guy, but nothing ever happened. I had to chase him all the time, and quite frankly, I'm one of those people who didn't finish mine because I just thought, I'm doing all the work here. I can't get any feedback. I can't get anything. Things were changing in my life, and he was just going, yeah, that's fine. We'll work it out. And what it did, it allowed me just to stretch something from 4 years to 6 years. And then in the end, it just got too hard.
You just didn't put any boundaries around anything. Yeah.
And then there's sort of your supervisor who's, there's a boundary issue there. They're almost, yes, supervisors, they're mentors and managers, but they shouldn't be friends. And there's that supervisor who gets a little bit too close. And we had a couple of examples in the program, following people on Facebook and all of these things, and going down to the Friday night, the pubs and everything. And I think some of that's okay. I think some of that is about building rapport. Some of that is, building that sense of trust and respect. But then, there can always be boundary issues there. And we've had a lot of stories over the years where, people have just got too close, and suddenly, it's no longer just that type of relationship. It's got other elements involved. And that creates a whole other level of complexity.
Yeah, sure does. I can speak from experience there. Early in my career, I probably didn't have those boundaries like I needed to be. And what I learnt really quickly was when you had to step in out of the role of friend to supervisor, sometimes the feedback, etc., wasn't very well received. It's like, hang on a second, we were doing that on the, and now it's this conversation, and they don't line up. And it's like that was something I learnt really on. Of course, in the absence of training, and everyone was kind of young, and I had a big group. So yeah, all that rings completely true to me. So I want to talk about the hierarchy just a little bit, but particularly about the pedestal. So academics tend to be successful in their field, and they've managed to navigate through either fortuitously or through being completely strategic or something, their academic career. And many young PhD students look at that and aspire to that. But one of the blind spots, I think, for students is there's sort of this underlying assumption that it's been a pretty straightforward and easy pathway. There hasn't been any significant hurdles, and that every time the academic writes a research grant, they get the money, or they submit the paper and it gets accepted, which is actually the opposite to what happens. You know, the success rates and the rejection rates are really high. So, how do you sort of portray that sort of, you know, that life is not just easy, because it's not, for a student to understand that the more authentic sort of side of being an academic, which is, you know, you need a shell. People can tell you that you're not any good a lot of the time. People will put lots of hurdles in front of you. Just so there's a greater understanding of that. And actually the PhD is actually a micro version of that career as well.
Yeah. Yeah, look, it's a great question. And one of the things we speak about in the supervisor training is that sense of not just a manager being that mentor, and not just setting up the person for the success in their PhD, but setting up for sort of lifelong, you know, academic success or career success. And that comes with supervisors being able to share a bit about their journey and really being open to that. Now, some supervisors are just more inclined to do that than others, but I'd recommend every supervisor has that opportunity to tell their story. You know, to be a little bit vulnerable, to talk to their students about, you know, these are some of my wins, these are some of my losses, and this is how I dealt with it. So they have a really powerful position of influence, but they also have an incredibly powerful position of helping people, you know, grow and develop. So, you know, it shouldn't just be seen in that sort of microcosm of just, you know, we're just here about a PhD. No, we're really here about, you know, really setting you up for lifelong success. And, you know, my role in that is, you know, to take you know, some mentorship to sort of paint a bigger picture that you're yet to see. And I think, you know, when I hear, you know, students say, you know, what was the great supervision experience? There's a couple of consistent things I hear. Not only, you know, it was respectful. Yeah, we sort of understood each other and we respected, you know, how we operated, and that had a lot to do with how we communicated, how we met, how we provided feedback, how we dealt with some of the challenges. Now, we had them, but we dealt with them quickly and we dealt with them in a respectful way. But one of the big ones I hear is, you know, they opened my eyes. It wasn't just the PhD we were focused on. They were also educating me to a whole range of other things. I heard, you know, some of their biggest successes, but they also were vulnerable enough to say, I really stuffed this up, or that didn't work, or this happened, and really helped me understand, you know, what the journey might look like, and sort of helped me prepare better for that journey. And I think when, you know, those stories, people wanted to maintain that relationship for a long, long time. They not only respected that person, but they admired them. And, you know, that's something that, you know, that carries sort of currency for a lot longer period. And, you know, we all know people talk. You know, when people talk really strongly about, you know, their supervisor experience and that supervisor, in the academic world, that you know, it is a lot about relationships and reputation.
Thanks, Andrew. That's a great answer. Can you just, to finish off the podcast, tell the audience a little bit about the training and what's covered and what it's about and what you hope the participants get out of the training?
Yeah, great. So it's half-day training. We have a half-day training for supervisors, a half-day training for students. We focus on, you know, how to set up this relationship for success. We talk about, you know, some of those, you know, clear warning signs when things are getting off track. We you know, help people practice, you know, effective ways to communicate, effective ways to give feedback. We talk a little bit about conflict resolution. Everybody gets the opportunity to fill out their little style questionnaire, which is often really insightful about their own style, but they also then get a bit of insight into their supervisor's style, because they can say, oh, that's like that. And it helps them understand where, yeah, this is why things work well. This is why we really connect. But for some, this is why we're disconnecting. And then we have a couple of scenarios that have been taken from, some of the ones from Monash and some of the ones from other universities, and people get the opportunity to work through those. What would happen? What would you do in these situations? And that's great because they're working those through with their peers. And so what we're trying to do is build a community of practice here, not only among students, but amongst supervisors. So it's been a really great program. It's been a great opportunity to co-develop with yourself and Arn, and great backup from admin such as Stephen. So it's been really good project, and hoping next year we'll run a few more.
Absolutely, we will. So, what album were you listening to most when you were doing your PhD?
Look, it would have been, because that was back in the mid-90s, Phil Collins, because I think it had all the range of emotions. His song, The Best of Phil Collins, because that had all the range of different emotions I was going through, a bit of depression, a bit of anxiety, a little bit of, I'm there. So I think that album at the time was probably the one that I was listening to. And of course, that was the days before Spotify, so we had to listen to a whole album. You can just listen to individual songs.
So, Andrew, I'd just like to finish off by saying thanks so much for sharing those fabulous insights about the complexities around relationships between supervisor and students, the requirements and strategies to go about sorting those things out at the beginning rather than trying to resolve crises towards the end. That's articulated in such a fabulous way. And I'm sure the students will get a lot out of this podcast. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Pete. It's been a pleasure, and thanks for the invite.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of PhD Raw, a podcast which shares authentic experiences about the PhD program and life beyond Monash Science. We hope you enjoyed the insights and valuable advice shared in this episode. As you navigate your own academic path, remember to embrace the challenges, celebrate your accomplishments, and value the connections you make along the way. Until next time, keep learning, growing, and making an impact in your field.